Welcome to the Aging Together podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Pooja Ashok Patel, an occupational therapist, board certified in gerontology with additional specialty certifications in dementia, fall prevention, and geriatric care. In this podcast, I interview guests who are experts in their fields and caregivers who share their lived experiences. Let's meet today's guest. Kristin Luckie has crafted compelling stories for some of the most ambitious organizations today, including AT&T, Movember, and the James Beard Foundation. A Jill of all trades with 15 years of communications experience, she works diligently to advance the profiles, services, and most importantly, the purpose of her partners, communicating thoughtfully through earned media coverage, owned content, major stage moments, internal communications, and executive thought leadership. In her spare time, or what little her infant son allows her, she volunteers as a support group leader for a local Alzheimer's advocacy organization and raises awareness for the disease in honor of her mother. Hi, Kristin. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and share your story with us.
Anything, of course. Happy to.
Let's start with an introduction. Tell the audience who you are.
Sure, of course. So my name is Kristin Luckie. I am a PR and communications consultant by trade, but I was a caregiver for my mother who was suffering from Alzheimer's disease from the time I was 22 until she passed away last year. I always say it's a unique silver lining to understand the caregiving space as well as I do. It's not a club anybody looks to join, but I am happy to be a part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you share the beginning of your caregiving journey? How did it all start?
Yeah, so my mother was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's when she was 60. I had just graduated college maybe only a year beforehand. And, you know, in hindsight, I think the signs were there for some time. It's just either blissful ignorance or just a lack of understanding. But, you know, by the time that she was diagnosed, it was progressed, it was pronounced, let's say. And that just really set us off onto this 14-year caregiving journey. My mother and my father are actually 9 years apart. So in the midst of all of this, you know, although she was diagnosed quite early, my father was already nearly 70 years old himself. And so if you think, you know, now he's 83, it was quite unique in the sense that we were caring for her along her progression and then equally trying to take care of an aging father at the same time.
Yeah, that's a lot. Oftentimes when parents are so far apart in age, it seems like, you know, you prepare yourself to care for the older parent and then something happens and all of a sudden now you're taking care of both, right?
Absolutely. I think everyone, you know, even from a, let's say, estate planning perspective, right? The assumption was always that we would need to coordinate care at some point in time for my father, whatever that would be. And so it was just a shock to everyone that my mom received this incredibly awful diagnosis and that in a twist of irony, it would be her that we would be really rallying around. It was just something that we weren't prepared for.
Yeah, it's hard to prepare for because we see so much, you know, the numbers don't lie and it says women outlive men statistically. And oftentimes the husbands are older. And so naturally we're inclined to think that, you know, we're going to have to plan for our dads. They're older. Statistically, they're going to die before our moms. And it just so happens that that's usually what we think about. And so when the opposite happens, it's really hard to really think about that. What were some of the biggest misconceptions that you had about caregiving before you began, and how did the reality of it differ?
I think that my experience with caregiving was always somewhat at an arm's length. You know, up until that point, we were taking care of maybe my grandmother after she had hip surgery. And all of that felt very, very normal, for lack of a better word. You know, my grandmother was older. it's not uncommon for older adults to have hip surgery. All of that made sense sort of in the iambic pentameter of life, right? I was surprised, I think, by two things. One, specifically with the diagnosis that my mother received, which was Alzheimer's, is that there is a stigma attached to degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's that just isn't necessarily attached to other diseases. So even in the case of my grandmother, if you're caring for someone like that who's had still a very major surgery, it is a much different situation than if you were caring for someone with a degenerative illness like Alzheimer's. And everything about the disease seemed like there was almost a film around it. Folks were scared to ask us about it. We were scared to talk about it. There was so much unknown. And so I found it was just a very unique experience with that particular disease. And I also think the second big takeaway for me that was super surprising was just the disconnect between people who were really mired in it every day, like my brother and my father and myself were, and the people who were not. And I say this, even of my close family members and friends who would offer to help. There's just such a difference between those who are in it and can appreciate all of the nuances and the difficulties of the disease, and the people who are not mired in the caregiving every day and who may have the best intentions, but because they're not close to it and they don't have that understanding, it's really hard for them to offer help because they just don't know what to ask or what would even be helpful. So, for example, saying, well, what can I do for you? As a caregiver, I cringe a little bit when I hear that, because the last thing that I want to do is create a list for someone, because I'm drowning myself in lists. I'm drowning myself in thinking of all the things that I have to do. The last thing that I want to do is think even more. And again, it's meant with such good intentions, but that is just a simple example of, if you're not really in it or make the effort to truly understand and place yourself into a caregiver's shoes, there's always going to be this disconnect that sort of furthers the isolation. And that was, I would love to say that I was prepared for it, but the reality of it was just something that I couldn't comprehend until I was in it.
Yeah, it's really difficult for people who have never been in those shoes to truly understand the gravity of the situation, right? It's interesting. My friends and I have talked about this a lot, of where, when someone needs help, we kind of just show up and do whatever, and it's really one of those things of like, just show up with food. I mean, basic necessities, right? Like when you're thinking of what do people generally need help with in their life, right? Or what do you do every single day that they also need to do, but likely are neglecting right now because they're so busy? And trying to think of even those little things like showing up and doing their laundry, showing up with food, like walking into their house, and if you see that the sink is full, like do their dishes for them. It's just crossing off one thing on their list that needs to get done versus asking them to do yet one more thing and tell you what to do, right?
Completely. I think now my advice for people when they say, a friend of mine has just been thrust into a caregiving role, what do? I give them that exact same advice. Buy a gas card, buy a gift certificate, take the initiative, and then the caregiver can kind of guide you and say, that was really lovely, but I really need this. But waiting for the direction, it just does no one any favors. I think about, the juxtaposition of when people have a baby. I have a young son, and the village that, really surrounded my husband and I when we had him was so lovely. Folks did send food. They would bring over sandwiches. They would, come over and make sure that the kitchen was clean, or they would sweep the floors, or they would let me find 10 minutes to hop in the shower. And I thought, this is so great, but where was this when I was 22? And it's really quite sad. I think, being a caregiver by choice and being a caregiver by circumstance are two very, very different things. But I think that there are lessons that we can draw, to your point, just to help the people around us who have, society doesn't support in the same way.
Yeah, this has come up over and over in the last probably 3 or 4 episodes that I've recorded. And it's that whole mentality of it takes a village. It is so widely accepted when it comes to rearing children. But when it comes to elder care, we don't think about it in the same lens. Like, oh, it's your parents. It's on you, right? And it's the kids are yours too, but everyone helps out, right? Everybody chips in. I always think about like the meal trains and just all of the support that people tend to bring out and pull together when someone's having a new baby is not the same as when somebody has to start taking care of a parent or an elder. And it is really hard. And, to your point about how young you were when you were thrust into that caregiver role, I had another young lady last season who was sharing how she was 23, I think. And at that age, we just can't even grasp the reality of that situation, right? Like, by the time that we're consciously, intentionally making the decision to become a caregiver, to have a kid or whatever it might be, we understand the realities of it. But when you're so young, when you really need that support, you don't even really truly grasp the reality of it until you're probably pretty far into it. And even then, that's if you have time to process it, right? Like that, what I've heard and what I've seen is that processing happens years down the line, right? Of looking back and reflecting and maybe seeing how much you missed out on, maybe seeing how much support you didn't have, maybe realizing the gravity of what you went through that you, quite frankly, didn't sign up for, right? And it's hard. That part's really hard. And as a society, we don't do a good job of preparing people for those inevitable caregiver roles that can happen at 18, can happen in your 20s, can happen in your 30s, can even happen in your 60s if you have a parent who's in their 80s or 90s, right? And it's really hard to share what that could be like when we ourselves don't know what to expect, right? And that's also why I think it's so important to share these stories for people who might be entering into these roles or potentially trying to plan for an inevitable role to hear different people's experiences, and maybe it'll set them up a little better.
Totally. I think about, someone pointed this out recently where they said, if you take even the workplace, for example, someone in my position, and I know this to be true, but generally caregivers, let's say by circumstance, they don't self-identify in a work setting. I'm much more likely to enter a work setting and mention that I have a son and I'm a parent and I'm a mom, but you don't have people willingly offering that information in the workplace. And to your point, I do think that there's so much that we could pick apart there, but part of it is because society has just not historically supported or prepared individuals for this kind of role in the same way as you would a parent. There are very defined parental leave policies. There are very ill-defined policies for supporting family or caregiving in general. And so all of this just compounds an already really isolating and difficult experience.
Yeah. The workplace is definitely a bigger beast when it comes to discussing, caregiver health and wellness and the resources and support in general. Obviously we don't have federal leave policies, but employer dependent policies are not always great either. And, I learned that I had to take, I tried to take FMLA a few years ago when my father-in-law was having heart surgery, and you can't use FMLA for in-laws. And it was one of those things where it was like, so if it was my parents, I could, but because it was my in-laws, I couldn't. And it's just like you said, they're just so strict and not formidable to what people actually might need, right? What were some of the most challenging moments that you faced as a caregiver for, I guess, both your parents, not just your mom, but both of them together, separately?
Yeah, I think even now with my father, having gone through it and being battle tested, I think the two things that tend to come up time and time again are finances and sort of the legality of estate planning. My parents had a will, but beyond that, we had never quite discussed really, really anything at all. My mother was the head of the household in that everything flowed through her. She knew all of the bank account passwords. She was the one who managed the money top to bottom for everyone in the house. When I say that, she was sort of the CEO, she was the CEO. And suddenly we didn't have the CEO anymore. And it's really difficult to try to determine how the CEO was doing their job when the CEO is no longer available to tell you how. And even to this day, again, having gone through it with mom and sort of the trial by fire of learning, we have this retirement account, we have this IRA, my parents had this savings here, and the other bank had this account. I mean, truly having to go learn everything ourselves, it is still something that I am not completely comfortable with. Again, I'm a communications strategist by trade. If you want me to grade an English paper, I'm happy to. But if you put a math test in front of me, I will likely fail. So it's really hard even now feeling confident, honestly, in these major life decisions. I am the financial power of attorney for my father. My brother was the financial power of attorney for my mom. And so I still feel quite a big burden of responsibility to ensure that I'm making the right choices, because at the end of the day, money is finite, right? It doesn't grow on trees. We had already been put through the ringer with my mother's care. It is incredibly expensive to have an Alzheimer's diagnosis, no matter how much money you set aside for it. And it's still a pressure that I feel. Are we making the right decisions for my father now so that we can adequately care for him should something come up? Or should he, fingers crossed, live another decade, which I hope is true. But again, another decade of care financially is quite a big ticket, and it's a lot of responsibility. And when it's not something that very well, it can feel incredibly intimidating. And I've been doing this for 14 years and I still don't quite get it. I'm very lucky in that my husband is a lawyer. So from a legal perspective, I at least have a little bit of help, but it is a whole new world. And it was one that I, again, didn't appreciate as a 22-year-old. And these are major decisions. These can have incredible implications, right? So even coming to terms with that is really hard, let alone, putting pen to paper and making the decisions. I think just being faced with it I found super overwhelming. And I don't think it's something that I'll ever feel completely comfortable with.
Yeah, the financial aspect of caregiving is a very deep dive. I've worked in the hospital systems long enough where I find that a lot of people have this misunderstanding that their health insurance will cover all costs related to caregiving, right? They're often like, I have Medicare, I'm good. And the number of times that I've had to explain to them that Medicare does not cover caregiving costs, right? And people don't generally have an idea of how much things cost, right? Like if you need someone to check in once a day, if you need someone to go a few hours every day, if you need to hire 24-hour care, if you want to transition into an assisted living facility, these are thousands of dollars that we're talking per month, not hundreds, right? And if there's no preparation for it, it's going to be incredibly difficult on your pockets.
Yeah.
And so, having gone through it, I know you mentioned that it's not something yet you think you'll ever feel comfortable with, but what advice do you have to other people as, regarding finances?
It's a good question. For context, my mother was first diagnosed. We were all completely shocked. Again, although the symptoms were there, I don't think you ever want to admit the truth. And she was really self-conscious about it. And so we didn't tell anyone at first. We sort of closed ranks as a family, and it was a big secret for a long, long time. And we just tried to be as normal, business as usual for as long as we could. And in hindsight, I regret that because I think we could have used that valuable time when my mother still had some coherence to really sit down and explain to us, okay, this is where the money is. This is what we've been saving. This is where you can draw from. Here are people who can help you. And we lost all of that time. So instead of using it to prepare, and my mother, again, CEO of the house, we were very fortunate in that we were raised in a middle-class neighborhood. My parents, my mother especially, was incredibly frugal and saved quite a bit. But at the end of her life, she was in a nursing home on Medicaid. The money was gone, even with all of that preparation. And so I would have used the time in the beginning of her diagnosis, I think, to try to do as much as humanly possible just to understand it a wee bit more. Have the conversations with your family about estate planning, about finances. It can be incredibly uncomfortable. And I get it, super, super morbid. But, I'm the person now who, when friends tell me that they're engaged or they're having a baby, I say, congratulations, do you have a will? Are you getting joint bank accounts? Do you need a financial advisor? Yeah. These are all things that you have to start thinking about with your parents, with your loved ones, and then with your own immediate family, because nobody has a crystal ball. And I wish we would have taken the time to plan ahead. Even with all of the preparation that my parents did, they intended to use that money for retirement, right? To take a cruise around the world. Nobody thought that we were going to use the money to pay for home health aides or for assisted living. And that's a very different situation. And we didn't prepare for that situation. In hindsight, I think you need contingency plans.
Absolutely. Obviously, this must have taken a toll on you personally and professionally, especially being fresh out of college. How did the caregiving impact both aspects of those life? And how did you take care of your own health and well-being while managing all the responsibilities that came with caregiving?
The simple answer is I didn't. I will say I have been lucky throughout the course of my career to work with a number of people who were incredibly understanding. And so even when I became a little bit more vocal about the disease, I was given flexibility where, one day a week I could work from home and take care of my mother. I could take time off as needed to look at assisted living facilities, or if she had a fall in the nursing home, of course, I could go to the emergency room with her. I was really lucky in that regard. But it's not easy having to juggle any of that. And it's not easy from a personal standpoint either, having to juggle any of that. I remember there was a St. Patrick's Day where all of my friends were getting together in Brooklyn to go to St. Patrick's Day party. And I spent the day, schlepping across New Jersey, touring assisted living facilities and memory care units. And it was just such a strange juxtaposition between what my friends were doing in their 20s versus what I was doing, or even dating, when and how to bring up the fact that my mother had a terminal illness and that this was going to be something that was potentially going to be part of that person's life as well. All of these things were so hard to navigate during that period of my life. And I didn't do a good job of it. It wasn't until I met my now husband and we started dating where he said, I really think you need to go to therapy. And, it was strange because I had been in therapy before. I wasn't, averse to it in any way. But I think sometimes there's also this sense, like you were talking about before, well, these are your parents. It just felt like a responsibility. But I've been in therapy now for 7 years, and I tell everybody it saved my life.
Even with just helping you process it all and helping you identify how you want to move forward.
Absolutely.
Were there any specific turning points or moments of realization that changed how you approached your caregiving journey?
Absolutely. There was a moment where my mother had been sick now for maybe 5 or 6 years and had progressed to the point where we had had home health aides and it was still just too much. And so we made the decision to move her into a memory care unit. And on the day that we moved her, there was a crisis at work on one of my accounts. And I spent the morning emailing the president of my company and the clients. And we moved her in that afternoon. And I remember thinking to myself, I spent the last morning in my childhood home with my mother, not spending time with my mother. She will never set foot in this house again. And I will never have her here ever again. And I spent it doing work. And I won't be able to get that time back. And it's I could cry thinking about it. It's one of my biggest regrets. And that was the moment that I said, okay, even working places, businesses that were flexible, I need to do a better job of making some very hard boundaries for myself and for my family. And I've been really firm about it ever since because I know what the trade-off is. And there have been times where, in reviews, people have said, Kristin is great to work with. It could be a glowing review. And every now and then, a comment will creep in to say, oh, but she's not always as available as I would like her to be. Or she told me that she couldn't schedule a call after 6:30. And I don't feel badly about that because I know what the impact is. And so I consider that probably one of the bigger turning points of the entire caregiving journey because it was so obviously traumatic. Like I'm tearing up thinking about it. But I think it taught me a valuable lesson. People always say you'll never get the time back with your family, but it is absolutely true. And I'm sorry that it took an experience like that for it to really sink in. But I'm grateful because I do think we need to set firmer boundaries as caregivers because, from a mental well-being perspective, a physical well-being, and the well-being of our loved ones, it's absolutely, absolutely critical.
Yeah. I teared up too with you sharing that. I mean, I think it's a bigger lesson in setting boundaries in general, right? I'm no stranger to some of those similar comments of, oh, like you're not available after 6 p.m. I'm like, no, I have a family. I'm not, right? Or if I'm working the weekend, I take Fridays off. Like you're not going to be able to book an appointment with me that Friday, And they're hard boundaries to set because you feel like you owe people your time, but in reality, you don't, right? And as unfortunate as it is, I'm glad that it led you to setting the boundaries today.
Yeah.
Right? When I speak with caregivers, a lot of emotions come up. Obviously, there's grief, there's regret, there's a lot of guilt sometimes about the decisions you made with the information you had at that time, with knowing what you know now.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that emotions can really impact your relationship with those people, right? How did your relationship with your parents evolve throughout the experience?
Oh gosh, that's such a good question. I think, with my mother, because she was so far progressed, we were incredibly lucky. You hear horror stories of people's personalities changing during Alzheimer's. And mom wasn't that way. She was still mom up until the very end. And I had a lot of emotions to work through because of the time in my life when she was diagnosed. I was 22 everyone's kind of a bit of a jerk in their early 20s. You're still a kid. And I felt tremendous guilt that so many years up to her diagnosis, I was a moody teenager, and then I was in college and I was partying, and then she was diagnosed, and I felt incredibly guilty that I didn't have the relationship with her that I wanted her to remember, or so I thought. And that was really difficult for me emotionally, because I'm very proud of how we took care of my mother and how I took care of my mother during the course of her disease, but I'm not proud of the person I was before she was diagnosed. And so that was a lot to grapple with. And then, it was really hard emotionally seeing the change in my father. My parents were married more than 40 years at the time of her death. This was the love of his life. And it can be really hard emotionally to watch your other parent go through a journey themselves. My father wasn't sick, but he was also changing. And I don't hold any grudges. I think, at the time, there were definitely moments where I was frustrated, where he wasn't accepting the diagnosis, or he would be quick to snap at my mom. But I think it's very natural, because spouses have such a hard time facing the reality of a disease like Alzheimer's. It's not uncommon. But I think emotionally, it was harder for me as time went on to just see the effect that it was having on him and how he was changing as a person. It's very difficult to grapple with seeing one parent suffer, which was my mother, but it was somehow even harder, I think, to watch the change in my father as well.
What does your relationship look like with your father now?
I think like my brother, my dad, and I all just feel a little bit battle worn. We went through something really horrible together for 14 years, but I consider myself one of the lucky ones, because we were a pretty close family beforehand. We remain very close, but it's there weren't moments where we had major disagreements. I think we always made a point to make sure when it came to mom's care, we were all on the same page. So in that respect, we were lucky. But with my father now being 83, I think he would be a different 83-year-old if the diagnosis didn't happen. Let's just put it that way. I think he would have been a very different dad and a different grandfather, for sure.
Yeah. That probably rings true for, I'm sure, you and your brother as well, right?
Of
You'd be
course.
different people today. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I do think, though, that it has made me more empathetic. Like I said, she was diagnosed when I was so young. You're kind of a jerk then in your 20s. At least I like to think that everybody is. But it forced me to grow up. And there are definitely things that I was doing in my 20s that other 20-year-olds weren't doing, like viewing nursing homes, for example. But I also think it made me a more empathetic, responsible adult. And so in some ways, I would never wish the diagnosis on anyone, but I am grateful for that.
Yeah. Were there any moments that were particularly rewarding or fulfilling for you as the caregiver?
I don't know if it was one moment or two in particular, but now being able to look back at the totality of it, I think the greatest reward is being able to say unequivocally, we took care of mom. Mom was safe. She was fed and clothed, and she felt loved. And we did everything humanly possible within our power to make sure that even in the face of a terrible diagnosis, that for the next 12 to 14 years, she was okay.
We're going strong on these emotions because that's generally what comes up when you're talking about this stuff. But during difficult moments, right? Because it ebbs and flows, right? Especially with Alzheimer's, you have good days and bad days. It ebbs and flows. And during those difficult moments, How did you balance your emotions so that you could make the most sound decisions? And maybe the answer is you did it, right? Because we all blow up at some point when it gets too much. But really, just is there a story that really showcases the emotional highs and lows of that journey during those difficult moments?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I mean, I trotted out my poor dad to say, oh, he would get frustrated with mom. We all got frustrated with mom.
Right.
And you try to remember, put yourself in their shoes. I will say that having therapy was something that I found really helpful in terms of that balance, because if there was a bad moment and I lost my patience with mom, I could talk about it in therapy the next day. I would say like the simplest thing that helped me was just to simply walk away. I mean, particularly with Alzheimer's, right? And I say this even as a parent, sometimes if our toddler is having a bad day, they're safe in their crib, nothing is going to happen to them. Sometimes mom just needs 5 minutes to cool down. And I think the same is true as a caregiver. Sometimes you just need 5 minutes to cool down and to gather yourself and to remember that this wasn't them, it was the disease. This isn't to say that Alzheimer's patients don't push your buttons. Toddlers push your buttons too. But I think just giving myself some space, physically, emotionally, mentally, even for just a moment, to ground myself in the reality of what was happening, which was, this is not your mother that you're arguing with. This is someone else, was really helpful. And of course, therapy.
Yeah. The most unkept secret nowadays. Speaking of difficult moments, you mentioned earlier you had to make the difficult choice of transitioning mom into a memory care unit. How did you navigate making that difficult decision? And what advice would you offer others facing similar choices?
It wasn't easy. We had, to your point about finances before, we had used a home health aide, but that wasn't covered by insurance at the time. And it was a lot. We were paying for 2 days a week, and it was still a pretty penny. And we thought, well, if we're spending all of this money and it's still not doing the thing, which is giving, my brother and I peace of mind, giving my father peace of mind, who was the primary caregiver, we need to look at an alternative. And we identified a facility nearby that had a wonderful memory care unit. And we're very lucky that we could afford the private pay option. But I won't say it was easy. There's still a reckoning, to not have your loved one in your childhood home, to know that, when I got off the train in New Jersey and I went back to my home, that my mother wouldn't be there, even though we knew in our heart of hearts it was the right decision, even though I knew that's what she would tell us to do. And so I think sometimes my advice to other caregivers is think about what another caregiver would tell you in this situation. Like, let them be the little voice on your shoulder when you start to doubt yourself. And I think by and large, most caregivers would say you need to do the thing that is going to help you the most so that you could be the best version of yourself to help your loved one. Or think about what your loved one would want. No one wants to see their child suffer. And we were suffering. We were really suffering. And I don't think my mom would want that. And so knowing that, even though we were separated from her, knowing that she would rather us be happy and healthy when we did see her versus the version that was coming home to her to take care of her, I think that made it a little bit easier, definitely.
Yeah, you can't fill from an empty cup, right? You have to do what will put you in the best position to provide the care that you want to.
100%.
And it really highlights the importance of having those conversations early if you're able to, right? Like you mentioned, yes, after the diagnosis, but even before a potential diagnosis, right? Like as soon as we become adults, having those conversations with our parents of, hey, if so-and-so happens, what do you want me to do? Right. And unfortunately, I mean, historically, I don't think we needed to have these conversations as much because life expectancy wasn't that long. And now it's very long. Like we become older adults while our parents are still older adults, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where it becomes so important from a life planning perspective, because you're no longer thinking of just 2 to 3 generations. Now you're thinking 3 to 4, maybe 5 generations, right? And that's only going to increase. And so it really brings up that point of, start having these conversations early, because it will only help you and your family down the road.
Of course, completely. I mean, even my husband and I have very clear instructions for one another should anything happen. And we're in our 30s. And, God forbid anything does, I feel very clear that I know what his wishes are, but I can't say that some of my friends are as clear. And so, to the point about, when I was joking before about, oh, do you have wills? Do you have this? It's incredibly morbid. I won't say that it isn't, but I can tell you financially and legally, it makes a hell of a lot of sense to have these conversations, because I know from experience, my family, we were on board with one another 100%, but there are a lot of families that aren't when it comes to healthcare proxies, or when a loved one does pass, should the person be cremated? Should the person be buried? And having these conversations just nips a bud in all of that. You're totally right.
Yeah, I have so many patient case scenarios that I could share on that, with multiple siblings who didn't agree on plan of care or course. It's definitely much, much, much easier to have things in writing way before needed. What you mentioned about, the living wills and legally having that understanding of like who gets to make decisions. So, kind of going back to what I was just saying about the multiple generations, depending on the state, if you don't have an identified decision maker, your decision maker, your surrogate decision maker can be someone different, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in certain states, in most states, I think it's your spouse. But if you're not married, or if your spouse is unable to make a decision, then next of kin actually goes to your parents before it goes to your kids. And so when you're talking about these older generations, right? So let's say I'm 60, I have a 40-year-old kid, and I have an 80-year-old mother. My 80-year-old mother is not going to be making sound decisions on my behalf compared to what my 40-year-old kid probably could, or my 30-year-old could, right? And so even understanding the legality around why it's so important to identify a surrogate decision maker is so incredibly important.
Absolutely. And, even with my brother and I, who are on board with every decision, he ultimately became the surrogate, whatever the
Healthcare power of attorney. Yeah.
Predominantly for my mother because of proximity. He was based in New Jersey. I wasn't. I would love to be involved in those kinds of decisions. And of course he would. But if there's an emergency and somebody needs to give the hospital directions, he's frankly just going to get there a lot faster than I could. And that would be selfish of me to say, well, hold the phone. You have to wait for me. And so, you really do have to put ego, discomfort, all of that aside when you're making these decisions, because it needs to be what's best for the loved one, and it needs to be what's best for the family. And these are incredibly difficult conversations. They're uncomfy. They dredge up so much in different families. And so I understand the hesitancy around having them, but not having them. Not everyone has a family like mine. And it's just so, so crucial. It's so, so crucial, because it can really, I don't want to be alarmist, but it could really avoid disastrous consequences, truly, for families and for loved ones that can take years to unravel. So it's absolutely necessary to do.
Absolutely. I always say, yes, these conversations are difficult, but the aftermath of not having these conversations are far more uncomfortable. How did your journey shape or change your perspective on life, family, aging, outside of understanding the benefit of proactively planning for finances, legal, all that stuff, right? But just in general, from a life perspective, like, did it change your perspective?
Definitely. I feel like people are going to say, oh gosh, she's a walking advertisement for financial advisors. And that is true. But I think there were two big takeaways I took from my journey with my mother and my father. And one is, preventative health. There are a lot of, and I say this very carefully because there are a lot of studies, using air quotes, about what can prevent something like Alzheimer's, what can help slow the progression of a disease like something like Alzheimer's. I've heard bread, I've heard red wine, I've heard this, I've heard that. But at the end of the day, I do think it comes down to trying to just live a healthy lifestyle. And so I have really tried over the course of the last few years to invest in workout classes, to get moving, to drink less, to eat healthier. This is not to say that my parents were not healthy people. My mother did yoga every week, but I don't think it was something that she invested in until she was retired. And she felt like she had time and that it was something that she could carve out for herself. I think that it's something that we have to carve out for ourselves regardless, because we are growing older, to your point, whether we like it or not. And you could choose to try to do what you can to live those years comfortably, which I think, eating healthy, working out, drinking less, all of those things should help you do, or not. And I choose to. I don't, if I were still to get, God forbid, an Alzheimer's disease myself, it wouldn't be great, but I would say, well, at least I had tried. And the other thing I think is just going back to my point about setting boundaries and work is that, your life and your legacy are built on the relationships that you have with the people that you love. And I think to my mother's funeral and the people who came to the wake and the stories that they shared, and even individuals that knew her from work didn't talk about work with my mom. They talked about what a great person she was. And so I think it really put a lot of things into perspective for me. My mother passed away when I was 7 months pregnant. And so I think that time in my life, especially about to welcome a son, I think it just solidified what I already knew to be true, which was there is nothing more important than your family. And so, yes, I set hard boundaries. And would that hurt me professionally? Maybe, sometimes. But I know at the end of the day that when I look back on my life, I'm going to look back on the moments that I shared with the people that I loved. I don't think that my mother spent, her last moments on her deathbed thinking about her work and her career. I like to think, and we did spend the last day with her, my family. And I like to think that that's what she wanted. I think that's what we all want at the end of the day.
Yeah. As we wrap up, what has this journey led you to?
Professionally, I've made it much more of a focus to spend time working with organizations and people and causes that I just feel invested in. Being in PR and communications, you don't always get the luxury of choosing who you want to work with and what you want to publicize. And that's something that I really try to do now. I want to feel personally very good about what I'm helping to support. And I would say personally, when mom was diagnosed, on top of therapy, I also just felt like I needed to do something. I needed to harness all of this energy, whether it was good or bad, into something that I felt was going to make a difference. And so I actually started volunteering really heavily with an organization in New Jersey called Alzheimer's New Jersey, where I led their young professionals group for some time. I did the walks every year to fundraise money. And now I'm a support group leader for a similar organization in Manhattan. So it does feel like my journey has kind of come full circle in a lot of ways, but I find that in talking with other caregivers a lot too, they feel the same way that, as I mentioned before, you're sort of thrust into this club that you don't want to be a part of, and you at least want to make something good out of it. And so that's what I'm trying to do now.
What is one takeaway you'd like the audience to consider as it relates to your journey?
If you think I'm going to say finances, I'm not, although that's very important. I would just say my lesson is just be as open as you can. We talk about how difficult it is for other people to connect with caregivers, but I don't want people to think that it's not worth trying, because there are a number of individuals around you and organizations around you who are so willing to help and who have expertise. And that was something that I regretted not doing, was not being more open and forthcoming about what I was thinking, feeling, and dealing with. And it took me a long time to find therapy, to find organizations like Alzheimer's New Jersey. And I always say the respite that those things gave me later on in my mother's disease helped me enjoy the moments that I had left with her. And I only wish that I had done it sooner. So if you are a caregiver who is just starting your own journey, please, as much as you're comfortable, just be open with the people around you, because there are helping hands who are willing to pitch in. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Kristin, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your journey with us. It was an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you. Likewise. I hope it's helpful.
I'm sure it will be. Thank you for tuning in to the Aging Together podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Aging Together, LLC, a caregiver coaching service with educational programming and support services for family caregivers of older adults. This episode was produced by me, Dr. Pooja Ashok Patel, in partnership with Natural Eye Media. If you found this episode of the Aging Together podcast valuable, we'd love your support in spreading the word. Please subscribe to the show. Your likes, shares, and reviews fuel our mission. Don't forget to rate and leave a review wherever you're listening. Your feedback matters. Until next time, take care.